Welcome back to Civil Wars. I'm William Spaniel, and this lecture is on misconceptions about the Syrian Civil War. So if you remember last time, we saw that the costs of war ensure the existence of a bargaining range, and any settlement within that bargaining range is mutually preferable to war. In turn, any explanation for war that we give has to explain why the parties don't choose to settle in that bargaining range and instead prefer to fight, even though fighting produces a worse outcome for both of them than had they settled within that bargaining range. And what we're going to see in this lecture is that the common explanations for the Syrian Civil War that you'll hear, especially from the media, don't actually explain why they didn't just settle and why they are instead fighting. So before I go over those common explanations that are bad, I want to hear from you. So go ahead and at this moment pause the lecture and in the comments section tell me what you've heard is the reason for the Syrian Civil War or what you think is the reason for the Syrian Civil War. Do that now. And now that you've hopefully done that, let's reveal what I think are probably the three most common answers to this question. First is ethnic fractionalization. And it is true that Syria is fractionalized. So this is the ethnic breakdown of Syria. We see a 60% Sunni majority and a 12% Alawite minority and a bunch of other minorities in there. The reason that the Alawites are more important than the other minorities is that the ruling family, the Assad family, is Alawite. So in this picture, we see the father of the current leader, Bashar al-Assad, is second to the left. In the back, he's the current leader. His father is in the front. The father has since died, and so Bashar al-Assad is now the leader of Syria. He is Alawite, and we see that a very small Alawite minority is ruling this country despite a very large Sunni majority. So this is a common explanation that you'll hear for why the Syrian war started. Now, what I'm going to show you next is not a reason why this is wrong. It's just a reason that is going to make you think about whether this is a good explanation or not. So this is the ethnic breakdown of another country, and we see a very large majority in blue, and the leader of this country is a part of that red sliver. You want to take a guess what country this is? Well, if I fill in the ethnic breakdown, it should be pretty obvious. So this country has a 63% white majority and a 13% African-American minority, and the leader of this country, of course, is Barack Obama. Although, to be fair, Obama identifies himself as an African-American, but his mother is white, so technically in this breakdown he should belong in the mixed category in orange there. Nevertheless, this does make you think, what actually causes war? Is it because you have an ethnic breakdown in the country that favors one side heavily, but another person from another group is the leader of that country? Well, at least it doesn't work in every single case, because here in the United States, things are fine despite the fact that an African-American is in charge of the country and we have a very large white majority. But I'll get to a better explanation for why ethnic fractionalization is a bad explanation for war in a second. The second common answer you'll hear is economic inequality. And again, this is true. Syria does suffer from economic inequality. The way we measure economic inequality is usually through the GINI coefficient. It's a very complicated calculation, so I'm not going to be doing it here or explain exactly how you derive it. But this calculation ends up being a number between 0 and 1, where 0 represents perfect parity. That's essentially saying that every single person in the country has the same amount of money. And a 1 means you have complete inequality, so exactly one person has all of the money in that country. So Syria's rank on this isn't very good. I could only find data from the World Bank going back to 2004, which is a while ago. Unfortunately, I couldn't find anything more recent. But you see that at the time, there was an economic inequality of 0.358. So that's not exactly where you would want to be if you were dictator of the world and could choose perhaps a fairer distribution of money. You'd probably be choosing something closer to 0. But on the other hand, if you pull out the United States' Gini coefficient from 2007, United States actually has more economic inequality than in Syria. So the United States' Gini coefficient is 0.45. Again, you don't see war in the United States. You do see war in Syria. What's going on there? The third explanation is the Arab Spring. So you'll remember that a few years ago now, a bunch of different countries in the Middle East started having some popular uprisings to try to throw out the regimes in power at the time that, of course, a lot of these people had a lot of legitimate grievances against. So this is another explanation that you'll see. But none of these explanations are satisfying. Take, for example, fractionalization. What is really causing the conflict in an ethnically fractionalized country is not the fractionalization itself, but the oppression. So let's say that you are in the Alawite the Alawite minority, and you're worried about a revolution because you're being very oppressive. Well, the simple solution to that, to avoid the war, is to simply relax those oppressions, open up social and economic freedoms. And once you've opened up those social and economic freedoms, well, that means the grievance of that very large majority, in this case the Sunnis, in Syria, will no longer have a reason to fight the war. They're getting exactly or essentially what they would want if they did fight a war, so there's no purpose for that war anymore. Why not just bargain away the problem instead? And that's why you don't see the United States fighting a war, because Barack Obama is not oppressing white people. If Barack Obama were to try oppressing white people, if you would start seeing ethnic breakdowns like that, where one ethnic group in the United States starts oppressing another ethnic group, then you would see fractionalization and tension within the United States. But because we don't do that, we don't see war. So the question then is, why doesn't Syria just relax those repressions and therefore avoid any sort of reason for war at that point? Again, bargaining is better than not bargaining. What about economic inequality? Well, simple solution there. If one side is very, very poor and you're very, very rich and the poor are going to fight you as a result of that, you can just throw them money. If really the inequality is the problem, you just make the country more equal, and then the grievance is gone and you don't have to fight, which is very good for you if you're Assad, because that means you're not getting yourself into a war, which could result you in being killed. Again, bargaining is better than not bargaining. Another problem with these first two explanations is that you can't explain variation with a constant. So fractionalization and inequality within Syria have existed for a very long time. This is not something that just started in 2011 when the Syrian Civil War started. So because of that, you can't explain using fractionalization or inequality why war started in 2011. Because if you're going to use those explanations, you also have to explain why war didn't start in 2010 or 2009 or 2008 or 2007 and so forth. But because those things remain constant over time, both fractionalization and inequality, you can't explain why those started a war in 2011 but didn't start a war at any time before that. On the other hand, one explanation, that third explanation, isn't a constant. That's the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring began not at any particular point way back, and it's continued over time, but it actually popped up a few years ago. So this is not constant, this is variation, so perhaps this might explain it. Unfortunately, again though, if an Arab Spring pops up, why, again, don't you just give people more money? And in fact, this is the solution that we saw in Qatar. So Qatar's solution to the Arab Spring, the regime was worried about perhaps tensions turning into revolution, and that would be bad for the regime in Qatar. Their solution was to simply increase money to dissatisfied groups. So civilians saw a 60% pay increase, unranked military received a 50% increase in their salaries. Military staff and officers, 120% increase. It's not a coincidence that those guys in charge of the military were getting more money, right? If you're going to satisfy someone because you're worried about revolution, you should probably be satisfying those people who have the military power. And of course, they also match the pensions with the same sort of salary increases. So the point here is that if you're a potential rebel and the Arab Spring is going on, and this is helping you coordinate your rebellion against a country, one thing that you're going to be calculating in your head is how much of a good payoff you're getting from the status quo versus what you're expecting to get from the outcome of a civil war. Well, if what you're receiving from the status quo today is very nice, right? If you're getting a lot of money and things are being very good to you right now, you don't have much of a reason to fight a war because the costs of conflict, the risks of you dying, aren't going to justify any sort of extra gain that you might receive if you were to fight a conflict. So again, this leaves the question of why don't we just bargain with, in this case, money being distributed instead of fighting? So the too long didn't read of this lecture is that the standard explanations for the Syrian Civil War are unsatisfying because they don't explain why the Assad regime didn't try to just broker a deal that both sides, both the Assad regime and the rebels, would have preferred to fighting that war. So that's something that we don't really have a good answer to in this lecture, but in a few lectures from now, we'll start trying to explain why the Arab Spring might have actually caused a problem with the bargaining situation and prevented a bargain from being struck. Hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time. Take care.